70% of Americans support voter ID. So the Democrats are now losing this argument. Understanding that they're losing this argument, Vice President of the United States, Vice President Harris, was interviewed by Soledad O'Brien on Black entertainment television networks. And Soledad O'Brien asks the Vice President of the United States about voter ID and voter integrity laws that the big bad Republicans are passing across the country. And we have that clip. It is pretty fascinating how Vice President Harris and the Democrats are starting to pivot away from this issue. Instead of saying it's Black people who can't get an ID, or Hispanic people, or poor people, now she's basically saying it's people who are in rural areas. Listen to this clip. Here it is.
People are talking about potential compromises. Is agreeing to voter ID one of those compromises that you'd support?
I don't think that we should underestimate what that could mean. Because in some people's mind, that means, well, you're going to have to Xerox or photocopy your ID to send it in to prove you are who you are. Well, there are a whole lot of people, especially people who live in rural communities, who don't, there's no Kinko's, there's no Office Max near them. People have to understand that when we're talking about voter ID laws, be clear about who you have in mind and what would be required of them to prove who they are.
I have no idea what that last part was. Be clear who you have in mind to prove who you are. So let's pull this apart. Let's pick this apart. The rural voters, the rural voters, easy for me to say, those are the voters who actually want voter ID. Those are the voters who actually have IDs and are willing, more than willing, to show them and want to vote in person. I want to say that again. It is the rural voters who want to vote in person with an ID. Those are the people who are willing to drive as long as it takes to get to the polls in person and vote. They are not the issue. So what Vice President Harris is doing is she's pivoting, understanding that now 70% of Americans want voter ID, and she's pivoting and not saying anymore, well, it's Black voters who can't get an ID, or who are incapable of showing an ID, or who don't want to show an ID, or can't afford to get an ID. She's not even talking about that anymore. It's rural voters, because in her mind, all rural voters vote by mail, which of course is not true. And she's saying they vote by mail. So therefore, if they are required to prove who they are, if they vote by mail, they would have to include a photocopy of their driver's license with the ballot. And that makes it just ridiculous, because she clearly doesn't understand the whole voter ID issue. Because if you live in a rural area, the chances are pretty good that you're able to use your cell phone and take a picture of your license, which you could easily copy at a neighbor's house, or you might even have a printer at your house. Chances are, by the way, if you have a computer at your house, including if you live in a rural area, and the chances of you having a computer are probably close to 100%, you probably have a printer too, and you can print the copy of your license. But even that doesn't properly describe or understand, at least not by Vice President Harris, how voting by mail occurs, because in many states, when you vote by mail, what they really want is for you to put your driver's license identification number on the actual ballot. So they probably want your date of birth on the ballot. They want you to verify that. They probably want your social security number on the ballot. And they probably want your driver's license identification number on the ballot as well. In which case, you don't actually need a picture of the actual license itself if you include that information on the ballot, because that would demonstrate that the person who voted, in theory, with that absentee ballot was indeed the individual it was intended for. But you could still even cheat then, let's face it, because there's a possibility that someone could ballot harvest and then take that ballot, from you and fill it out and drop it off at the local election board. But according to Harris, it's the rural voters who are incapable in any way, shape, or form, of providing voter ID, which of course everybody knows. Look, I live in an area that at least at one time was considered rural. Now I would say it's considered, in some cases suburban, some areas of it are rural. Certainly the area that I live in is rural. And the closest place for me to vote is about 10 to 12 minutes away to vote in person. Okay. So it's about 12 minutes away. Now to be fair, it's probably, 5-6 miles, right? But it's 12 minutes. That's how long the drive is. And I show up in person, and so does everybody else. By the way, people who are black, people who are Hispanic, people who are white, men and women, people of all different backgrounds, and they all show up. And they're all perfectly capable of showing their ID, except that I live in a state where you don't show your ID. Because we don't require that in Maryland, God forbid. So this is just a ridiculous concept by Vice President Harris. And it shows you that they're losing, because when you hear that clip where she's being interviewed by Soledad O'Brien of Black Entertainment Networks, you realize how disconnected she is from the American people, and how the American people realize this is all sham. This is all about one simple thing with the Democrat Party. They want to continue to cheat in elections because they don't want verifiable elections that require voter ID. I really think it's that simple. And there are very few people, by the way, who are willing to actually say this. They intimate it, but they don't actually just come out and say, Democrats want to cheat. That's why they don't want voter ID. These are the same Democrats in Austin, Texas, who are flying home to mommy, to Joe Biden, that's their mommy in government in Washington, D.C., because they can't bother to stay in Austin, Texas, and vote for voter integrity laws and voter ID laws. And it's just absurd. And Harris's comment reminds me so much of Hillary Clinton, because Harris is essentially attacking rural voters and saying, you know what, they're just too stupid to show voter ID because they don't have copiers or printers or computers back there in the rural areas. They're just not very smart. Well, that reminds me exactly of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Because in September 2016, Hillary Clinton gave a speech, I believe it was in Manhattan, to all of the glitterati of, the Northeast, all the rich and the powerful and the connected and the phony elites. And she gave this speech in 2016, in September of 2016, just a couple of months before the election that she lost. And when she gave this speech, it was so obvious how disconnected she was, just like Vice President Harris is disconnected from voters in rural America. Here's Hillary Clinton.
To just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that.
Yeah, so that was Hillary Clinton in 2016, in September of 2016, attacking basically all of the Trump voters, and as well as, by the way, a lot of voters who were in the rural areas who probably, some of them didn't vote for Donald Trump and may have wanted to vote for her and probably changed their mind at that moment, because she's essentially saying they're hicks. She's saying that they're stupid, that they are homophobic, and they don't like change, and they cling to their guns. And Vice President Harris literally just said to Soledad O'Brien, as we played before, that people who live in rural America are too stupid to use voter ID or to comply with it because they don't have photocopying equipment in their houses. It's just a complete misunderstanding of this country. And Democrats continue to make fun of half of the people in this country. They continue to do it. They continue to disrespect them. They continue to look at them as if they are sub-American. They're not really deserving of being here. And it just continues to get worse and worse with this party. I mean, look, Harris is a lightweight. With Hillary Clinton, I actually think that it was the real Hillary Clinton that came out and said that. I think she is a good politician, but made a really dumb mistake. And that her inner self finally came out, and she said it because she felt comfortable with the elite people that she was talking to, all the connected people, the right people. And she paid a price. She lost the election. With Harris, I just think she's stupid. I think she's a bad politician. I think she's gotten very lucky throughout her life because she's never been challenged. You don't get challenged in California when you're a statewide office holder because it's a one-party state, right? You know, it's true. You might have some congressmen who are Republicans in California who go to Washington, but they're from rural California. But if you want to run statewide in California, like for governor or for some other statewide office like the United States Senate, you're not going to get elected if you're a Republican. And you're never really going to be challenged as a Democrat when you do get elected, because you're either left or you're really far left. And that's how you get elected there.